Hello and welcome to Inside the Vault. My name is Sandy Trenholm and I'm the collection director for the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. And today we're going to be discussing a summary view of the rights of British America, and it's a pamphlet that was published in 1774. So before we do that, I want to introduce our team tonight. Joining me is Dr. Andrew Robertson. He's an associate professor of history at the City University of New York Graduate Center and at Lehman College. And he's written numerous books on the founding era, including Henry Knox. And we've worked together for close to 20 years. You've worked with Gilder Lehrman probably a little bit longer than that. So do you want to say a few words to everyone, Andy?
Well, thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here doing another Inside the Vault presentation tonight. I think these sessions are wonderful because we get to learn so much about the Gilder Lehrman collection, about these original documents. The questions that come from you, the audience, really are stimulating and elicit such an lively discussion. I think we all learn from these things. So I can't wait to get started. It's, I know, going to be a great opportunity.
Thank you. So also joining us tonight is Shelby Miller. She's our curatorial intern. She's on the back end. She'll be moderating a Q&A and putting some information in the chat for you. So go ahead and say hi to Shelby in the chat. And of course, Allison Kraft, our assistant curator, is going to tell us how to participate this evening.
If you have a question for Andy or Sandy or just our panel in general, we ask that you use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. It's that little Q&A, those two little bubbles that you see there. That's how you can talk to us. We will be answering audience questions throughout tonight's program. And there are a few hundred people in tonight's session. So if your question is not answered or you know, we don't respond to it, it's not that it was a bad question. They are all fantastic questions. We just only have an hour to get through this program tonight. So we appreciate you sending those questions in. For safety, security, and privacy of everybody who is in tonight's program, your chat is disabled and your microphones and cameras are off. Again, if you want to talk to us, use that Q&A feature.
Thanks, Allison. Okay, and with that, we're going to talk about tonight's document first, the star of the show. So it's commonly known as a summary view of the rights of British America. It's a pamphlet published by Thomas Jefferson in 1774. But as you can see here, the title is actually much longer than just the summary view of rights. The second half of it is set forth in some resolutions intended for the inspection of the present delegates of the people of Virginia, now in convention, by a native and member of the House of Burgesses. So our copy is really interesting. It's a second edition. It's printed by John Dunlap in Philadelphia. And today, fewer than 20 copies of this pamphlet exist. So it's really, really rare. And if you've heard of John Dunlap, some people have, he is the one who's going to first publish the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And he also partners with Claypool later on. So Dunlap and Claypool are the official printers to the Constitutional Convention. So all 5 of those first editions of the Constitution are printed by John Dunlap and Claypool. There actually is a first edition that still exists. There's 8 copies of that, and it was published by a woman named Clementina Rind. She was the official printer to the Virginia House of Burgesses. I think it's pretty cool that there's 9 that survive, and it really captures how important these early editions are to make sure that there haven't been changes over the years. And with that, though, we're going to turn it over to Andy to give us some background so that we can understand what this document's about.
Thank you, Sandy. I'm happy to get us started here. The first question is, what was the House of Burgesses? And I want to call your attention to the date 1619. We've all heard that the date 1619 marked the introduction of African slavery to Virginia colony. But 1619 marks the anniversary of another very big event in the history of colonial Virginia, the inauguration of the House of Burgesses. That is the first representative body of government elected on a sort of quasi-democratic basis for making laws in the colony of Virginia. So in a sense, that's kind of, expresses what are the 2 sides of American history that we need to come to terms with. One is slavery and one is representative government. And they both start in the same year, A year before, by the way, the Pilgrims actually landed at Plymouth Rock. So before any other English colonial settlement, 1619, both those things had already happened. So the House of Burgesses has a long and illustrious history, making laws with the upper house, the governor's council in colonial Virginia, until 1774. And at that time, when the Virginia House of Burgesses was under the um, in conflict with the governor of Virginia, whose name was Lord Dunmore. Lord Dunmore dissolved the House of Burgesses. And so, as a result, the House of Burgesses regrouped and reinstituted itself under a new name, calling itself the Virginia Convention. And there were actually 4 Virginia conventions. And so they sort of were spontaneously generated, as they saw it, by the people, elected representatives who came out of the House of Burgesses. And these people then initiated a series of resolutions that were in opposition and in resistance to what they saw as the encroachment of royal authority on the part of the governor and on the part of the king and parliament. So what was Thomas Jefferson's role in all this? Thomas Jefferson, if you know much about his personality, was an interesting person. He was a very eloquent writer. As John Adams noted kind of sheepishly, you write 1,000 times better than I do, and you should be the one to author the Declaration of Independence. Most of the founders, male and female, recognized that Jefferson was the most eloquent and visionary writer in the group. But he was also painfully shy, and he was very conflict avoidant. He did not, unlike some of the other founders, think of John Adams or Alexander Hamilton, he did not like to get into kind of fierce, engaged debate. That wasn't his style at all. He was really kind of shied away from that. But he was very happy to make a provocative argument in writing. So he didn't attend the Virginia Convention, but he did draft the resolutions and the summary view for the Virginia Convention, which were then published anonymously. Now, why anonymously? You have to remember that at this point, when there's significant repression being enacted by the governor of Virginia and by other colonial authorities, royal authorities, it was rather dangerous to publish any kind of provocative argument. You could get yourself fined or even imprisoned for making a very provocative argument favoring resistance to the crown. And so Jefferson authored this pamphlet anonymously in 1774. By 1775, everyone in the colonies, everyone who was in the committees of safety or in other bodies of the colonial resistance, the people who had been in the First Continental Congress, who read this published document in its anonymous form first, by 1775, they know it's by Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. And so by 1776, when the time comes to write the Declaration, they all go back and say, well, let's look at the resumes, the CVs of these guys, and see who would be the best person to put on this committee. They put Benjamin Franklin and John Adams on the committee to draft the Declaration, but the star is Thomas Jefferson. He's the great visionary, eloquent writer. Whatever you would say, both the others were brilliant minds. If you watch the PBS program on Benjamin Franklin the other night, you can appreciate that, but no one could write like Thomas Jefferson. And what is British America? A summary view of British America. We think about the British Empire in the Atlantic. It includes a lot more than the 13 colonies. It includes Nova Scotia. It includes Canada, which has already been incorporated under the Quebec Act. It includes the British Caribbean islands like Jamaica. But when Jefferson is speaking about British America, he's speaking about those colonies founded on the North American continent. He's really speaking about the 13 colonies that we know today, not Florida, not Nova Scotia, not Canada, and not the Caribbean islands. They have particular unique features, and he's describing those features. That's what he's addressing.
Thank you. And so with that, we are going to kick off our first quote. Now, this is a 23-page pamphlet. It's a very dense text. So we asked Andy to select some quotes to highlight, and I think we did a pretty good job at getting to some real meaty things to dive into. So Allison is going to read the quotes, and then we're going to ask Andy to tell us about them. So
Okay.
Allison?
His Majesty will think we have reason to expect when he reflects that he is no more than the chief officer of the people, appointed by the laws and circumscribed with definite powers to assist in working the great machine of government, erected for their use and consequently subject to their superintendence.
So think about this description of the king. This is a king in a very limited government. This is the very early stage of constitutional monarchy, if you want to put it that way. There had been some limitation on the king and on sovereignty, going back, of course, to Magna Carta, the English Civil War, and especially relevant would be the Glorious Revolution of 1688, where Parliament declares themselves sovereign. But this is a much more limited conception of His Majesty's role than would have been acceptable by, say, the London establishment, whom Jefferson is arguing against. The king is a very active player in British politics. He has an active constitutional role, and this is a far more limited understanding of the British monarch than most Englishmen would have accepted.
You. We're going on to the next one. Since some of these quotes break apart on 2 different pages, some of them we're going to have as transcripts and some we're going to represent, straight from the pamphlet. But the next few are going to be in transcript form. So Allison, would you care to read this one for us?
And in order that these our rights, as well as the invasions of them, may be laid more fully before His Majesty, to take a view of them from the origin and first settlement of these countries, to remind him that our ancestors, before their immigration to America, were the free inhabitants of the British dominions in Europe, and possessed a right which nature has given to all men, of departing from the country in which chance, not choice, has placed them, of going in quest of new habitations, and of their establishing new societies, under such laws and regulations as to them shall seem most likely to promote public happiness.
Now, this is a very provocative argument about the origins of English colonial settlement in America. Think about it. I mean, when we know very well, first of all, let's take just Virginia itself. It's founded by the Virginia Company. It's after 20 years, it becomes a royal colony. It has an established church. It has significant aid from the British government for its military defense, as well as other things. Now, what Jefferson is saying here is that the Virginians who came, the Englishmen, right? Of course, we're not speaking of the slaves here. The Englishmen who came here chose to come here. And since they chose to come here of their own volition, when they established a land claim, it was theirs without any restrictions. It didn't come from the king, and he makes a long argument about how in England, after William the Conqueror, most land titles were granted by the king, and the king had the ultimate title to all land under the feudal system. But he says that in the American colonies, it's what he calls, what lawyers at the time called an alloidial system, which is that they came to a blank place, free land, and made a claim on a free settlement. Now, he goes back to the history of England and the Saxon conquest. He says, well, this is what happens with the Saxons before the Norman conquest. And then he says, this is what happens in America. There are two problems with that history. Number one, if you've ever read about King Arthur, who's a fictional character, of course, but about the British in England, they were Celtic Britons before the Saxons got there. And if you think about the same thing happening in America, that when the Virginians arrived, there were native nations, the Powhatan Confederacy, right there on the James River, which had land claims to the entire James River watershed, most of the southern Chesapeake Bay region. All of those lands were claimed by one or another of the native peoples. So you could hardly, I think, make a really legitimate claim that this was an alloidial land claim, or that the Americans as individuals had rights because they settled there as individuals rather than as a collectivity. It doesn't hold for Virginia, and it certainly doesn't hold for the New England colonies, which tended to settle as communities. He's writing about all of the colonies here, and it's a what would we say, a contentious, and I guess as a historian I would say, and most historians have said, a dubious argument. It makes a good legal challenge to the rights of the king and to his prerogatives, but we have to say, there was someone here first, and they didn't all come over here, and they were not lacking for aid and support throughout the early years of settlement. I will say one more thing, though, about this, because that's true in principle. It's also true that, in fact, because the English were embroiled in a civil war in the middle of the 17th century and then in the Glorious Revolution, they were, forgot the Restoration in between. They were involved in a lot of tumultuous events in England. England was too busy fighting among themselves to spend a whole lot of time helping American settlement or interfering with it. And to that extent, in some degree of fact, he has something of an argument. But in terms of principle, this is a very provocative argument, and it's not really based in fact. No native would accord to the Americans the right to alloidial settlement. Oh, it was just blank here. Yep, thanks for coming in and making it yours. Nuh-uh, that doesn't work.
I think Allison has some questions for you.
Sure.
I do. So the first one is a visual. So if you could go to the title page, Sandy.
Sure.
This question comes from Anne, and Anne says, the title page includes a handwritten T. Jefferson. Is this his autograph?
No. Nope, sorry about that. Someone just wrote T. Jefferson on it. I wish it was his. That would make it even better, but unfortunately it's not. It's a great question, though. We don't know
Absolutely
whose it is, unfortunately.
And those are, great observational skills. We tell students all the time, what do you see on this document? And if that's the first thing that you see, then you're definitely using those keen observation skills. Second
So
question
hold on,
comes
Andy,
from.
you've seen a lot of Jefferson's handwriting. How do you think that compares?
Oh, really well. I mean, if someone signed a check, they didn't have bank checks in the way that we have them today. But if someone had late in Jefferson's life had signed a bank note with that signature, they might very well have got away with it. I mean, that's a pretty good facsimile. If you look at the Declaration sometime, that's pretty good. Yeah.
Cool. Thank
Too
you.
bad that it isn't the real thing.
I know.
The next question comes from Joe, and Joe is in West Palm Beach and wants to know if this document is pretty well known. Joe says that they haven't heard of this document before.
Joe, it's known to most historians, anyone who's actually kind of really looked at Jefferson and looked at the documents he writes. I mean, this is his kind of the first big writing that people who know Jefferson's work would be aware of. So that would be historians. It's a great document for teachers because it gives us kind of the early stage of Jefferson's thought about why they would eventually seek independence. It's like a prequel to the Declaration of Independence. So I mean, anyone who's reading the Declaration and writing about it, all the great scholars, Pauline Maier, who's one, David Armitage is another. These are just recent scholars. My heavens, there are plenty more that have written about the Declaration for 200 years. But just scholars who write about this always go back to the summary view, because then you get the prequel, you have the origin story. Okay, that's how he comes to this idea. And a lot of the arguments he doesn't go into. He doesn't make this pretty, as I said, pretty extravagant claim about a Lloydial land tenure in the Declaration. It isn't there. But we all know that he was thinking it, and he, I'm sure, was still persuaded of it when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. So it's something that we should be more aware of. I think it's a really good document to teach.
And it's 23 pages, so you can chunk it out kind of like Andy has done it here for us, or you can let your kids have at it and see what they find interesting about it too.
Yeah, that's right.
And I wanted to
just say one other quick thing about it. I mean, it's definitely not, you can see the development of Jefferson's prose style from 1774 to 76. And he had the help, Franklin and Adams may not have been the kind of eloquent writer that Jefferson was, but they're great editors, both of them. Remember, Franklin, if you saw that PBS show, you'll know, was really, he was a printer and editor most of his life. So he was able to make some very key editorial changes, and so was Adams in that document. And this is a little bit, it's dense, and it's more dense by far than the Declaration. So that is, you've got to kind of open it up and unpack it for your students.
I just wanted to toss in before we move on that Joe added that they're a teacher and teaches AP US government. So very glad to hear that this will be used in the classroom, Joe.
Thank you. So Allison, do you want to read the next quote?
Sure. I had to toggle my microphone there. Nor was ever any claim of superiority or dependence asserted over them by that mother country from which they had migrated. And were such a claim made, it is believed that His Majesty's subjects in Great Britain have too firm a feeling of the rights derived to them from their ancestors to bow down the sovereignty of their state before such visionary pretensions. Not a shilling was ever issued from the public treasures of His Majesty or his ancestors for their assistance till a very late times after the colonies had become established on a firm and permanent footing.
Okay, so here we really need to unpack it a little bit. Nor was ever any claim of superiority or dependence asserted by the mother country, by England, from which they had migrated. And were such a claim made, it is believed that His Majesty's subjects in Great Britain have too firm a feeling of the rights derived to them from their ancestor to bow down the sovereignty of their state before such visionary pretensions. That means if the Brits, who knew where their rights came from, had this kind of claim of excessive monarchical prerogatives pushed before them, they would not be bowing down before it, because they're, as Englishmen, as Britons, right? They have a sense of what their rights are, and they wouldn't put up with this. Now, not a shilling was ever issued from the public treasures of His Majesty or his ancestors for their assistance till a very late times, after the colonies had become established on a firm and permanent footing. Well, many colonies, and Virginia in its early days included, were, of course, started by joint stock companies. Some colonies, like Pennsylvania and Maryland, and later Georgia, North Carolina, and New Jersey, were proprietary colonies. And so, a lot of the output for those colonies was established by the proprietor and by the people who invested in the colony. That's certainly true, but it's also true that many shillings went out over the years for defense. They went out for establishing things like churches, missionaries, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which is an extension of the Church of England. That was in the early 18th century. There were all sorts of attempts from the public purse to defend, to expand, and to enrich the lives of the colony, as well as to regulate them and make a better profit. That was certainly the utmost and the topmost priority of the mother country. These colonies have to make us a profit.
Thank you. We're going to go on to the next slide. So Allison, do you want to read this one?
That the exercise of a free trade with all parts of the world, possessed by the American colonists as of natural right, and which no law of their own had taken away or abridged, was next the object of unjust encroachment. But that we do not point out to His Majesty the injustice of these acts with intent to rest on that principle the cause of their nullity, but to shew that experience confirms the propriety of those political principles which exempt us from the jurisdiction of the British Parliament. The true ground on which we declare these acts void is that the British Parliament has no right to exercise authority over us.
Okay, this is one of the passages where the rubber hits the road. What is this all about for the colonies? What is their utmost, their primary grievance? Okay, it's certainly about taxation, right? That's the thing that's right in front of them. But behind that is the idea of free trade. Their trade is restricted, as we all know. All of us who are history teachers know that the Navigation Act heavily restricted and made irrational some of the kinds of trade that many of the founders wished that the American colonies were allowed to engage in. Trade with the Spanish colonies, for example. Trade before the French and Indian War with French Canada. Trade with other parts of the world where they knew there could be a quite lucrative, profitable trade, but they were restricted from conducting it except as it was funneled through the British Isles. Okay, so the exercise of a free trade with all parts of the world possessed by the American colonists is a natural right. Now, this is a Lockean notion. It's an idea that most of the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers speak of. There's a natural right to trade. They're speaking of, Adam Smith speaks about this, and which no law of their own had taken away or abridged. So, but it's the object of unjust encroachment by the crown. And again, this is arguing we had free trade and now you're encroaching on it. Well, there was increasingly restricted trade, especially in the 18th century and especially after the French and Indian War, but there was restricted trade. There were navigation acts. There were trading acts that restricted colonial trade. The colonies were there for a reason, to provide raw materials. They were restricted and prohibited from engaging in any kind of manufacturing, right? Because that would compete with the mother country, with England. And all those acts go back, not just to the 18th century, but some of those restrictions go back to the 17th century. Okay, so we point out to His Majesty the injustice of these acts with intent to rest on that principle, the cause of their nullity. No, it's not because it's unjust that we're saying they're void, but to show that experience confirms the propriety of those political principles which exempt us from the jurisdiction of the British Parliament. But the true ground on which we declare these acts void now, null and void, this is an early version of nullification, is that the British Parliament has no right to exercise authority over us. That's a very powerful and provocative and radical argument, because most patriots agreed that the British Parliament had no right to tax the colonists, right, in any for any internal product, right? That's why the Stamp Act was greeted with such resistance. But they certainly have never argued that the British Parliament has no right to exercise authority over us. In any kind of international trade, the British Parliament has always exercised authority in some ways, right? So this is saying, well, it was unjust and it's unconstitutional under the British Constitution. And so these acts are void. The British Parliament has no right to exercise authority. This is, remember, something like what Franklin is arguing in the Act of Union. We should have our own parliament on this side of the Atlantic, on the western side of the Atlantic. They would make laws for us and we would be under the king, right? And so we'd have a kind of, we would be separate from the British. We would not be under their authority. A little bit like what the Scottish Parliament is today, right? The Scottish Parliament has authority on Scotland for all domestic matters. When it gets to foreign policy, that's the British Parliament, the UK Parliament that meets in London, that still has the laws. This sounds more radical than that. The British Parliament has no right to exercise any authority over us. So it's quite a provocative statement, and you can see how it leads to the Declaration of Independence. He's saying we have a natural right to free trade. Okay.
Andy, before we move to the next one, and I know Allison has questions, but I'm going to ask a question too. Were other countries imposing the same rules upon their colonies as well, restricting trade and manufacturing?
Absolutely. So this was not, the British, if anything, were a little more lenient than the other colonies. But it was absolutely vital that the Spanish would have a monopoly on trade, say, with Cuba, tobacco and sugar. France wanted a monopoly on trade with the French island of Saint-Domingue, today's Haiti, because they wanted to keep that very profitable crop for themselves. So the other colonies were at least as restricted, and they were all restricted for a reason. Colonialism from the 16th century onward developed so that these European powers, Spain, Portugal, England, France, the Netherlands, could monopolize the raw materials of these places that they claimed, and then exploit those raw materials for their own merchants in the mother country.
Allison?
So a very frequent question we're seeing in the Q&A is how GLI came to acquire this pamphlet.
I could look that up for you really quickly. We get materials two different ways. I can't remember the exact year we acquired this. It was, Allison talks about donations a lot, but this was actually purchased at auction. Those are the two most common ways we get things: through donation, which is our favorite way, and through auction. But we acquired this one at auction. I don't remember which year it was, though. I apologize for that.
So the next question is from Robert, and Robert wants to know if Jefferson had any reason to believe that King George III would see this pamphlet, or if it was really written just for Virginia politicians. Oh, Andy, you're muted.
Yeah,
there we go.
I'm sure, believed that the people in government would read this pamphlet. It's republished in London, and they know, and it's republished in Europe. He knows that they're going to be reading it in London and Edinburgh. They're going to be reading it throughout the British Isles. The political class and the political elite and the larger circle of public opinion would eventually hear about this argument. Jefferson's name isn't attached to it right away. So Jefferson, isn't one of the big A-list celebrities in terms of the Americans, the people that they will soon look on as their enemies. Franklin and Washington are I remember Professor Gordon Wood saying this, the only two Americans that George II ever would have heard of were George Washington, because of the outbreak of the French and Indian War, and Benjamin Franklin. This guy, who is he? He's a Virginian. But they take heed of this argument. This is a radical argument, and they would notice it. And they did, and it was published in London.
Time for one more before going on, or should we move on to the next?
Go ahead,
Okay.
we got time for one more.
Sorry, I had a question and then I completely lost it. So the next question comes from Elizabeth. Elizabeth wants to know if these papers were explained to the common man, and if so, how and when.
Great question, because it really illustrates the difference between the summary view and the Declaration of Independence. Okay, when you think about the summary view, this is he's thinking about his audience. Who is his audience here? His audience is the Virginia Convention. Who are these guys? These are landed gentry from Virginia. Okay, that's his first audience. He's sending out to these people he knows now. He was in college in Williamsburg. He used to attend the House of Burgesses, as most of those young men, wealthy men who would eventually inherit, not inherit by right, but inherit in an election, inherited from their position, an opportunity to get elected to the House of Burgesses. So they were all watching it. You know, this was like political theater. This was exciting. This was, you wouldn't have many plays coming into Williamsburg during the course of a year, but this was exciting stuff. You go down to hear the great orators. Patrick Henry gave the great speech at the next Virginia convention. So they're all thinking about, you know, what this means. Jefferson is writing for that audience, okay? And when it gets to the First Continental Congress, same group, a political elite in the 13 colonies, 12 of the 13. The Declaration, who are the first people to hear it? Remember, it's read at Independence Hall to the people. Who are the first people outside of Philadelphia to hear it? The assembled soldiers, the enlisted men. George Washington orders that this be read to his men encamped outside of Philadelphia. They will hear it first. So it's a very different document. It's written in a much more accessible style than this summary view. That's one of the reasons that I think, you know, it hasn't quite received the attention, but I think it's a perfect document if it's unpacked properly to explore Jefferson's ideas.
And I know the Declaration's printed in newspapers all throughout the colonies. It's printed on posters or broadsheets all over the colonies. So pamphlets are just more restricted too, in how many you can print, how far they get distributed. They're not like posted anywhere. Like you said, you can't read 23 pages on a stump outside of town hall.
Other thing, the Declaration is designed to be read out loud, to be heard that way. If you read it aloud, as we always do when I've conducted seminars and classes on the American Revolution, documents of the American Revolution, you can't understand it unless you hear it. You don't understand the pauses. You don't understand the emphases. It doesn't make as much sense. This was not that kind of pamphlet. It wasn't designed to be read aloud. It was designed to be read in pamphlet form, maybe in a coffee house, maybe in a legislative chamber, maybe in a tavern, but you read it. Maybe you read it with a couple of your friends looking over your shoulder, but you read it to yourself.
And studied it, sort of like when you're studying a book. All right, so we're going to go on to the next quote, which I think some people might be surprised at. So Allison, could you read this one too?
For the most trifling reasons, and sometimes for no conceivable reason at all, His Majesty has rejected laws of the most salutary tendency. The abolition of domestic slavery is the great object of desire in those colonies, where it was unhappily introduced in their infant state. But previous to the enfranchisement of the slaves we have, it is necessary to exclude all further importations from Africa. Yet our repeated attempts to effect this by prohibitions and by imposing duties which might amount to a prohibition have been hitherto defeated by His Majesty's negative, thus preferring the immediate advantages of a few African corsairs to the lasting interests of the American states, and to the rights of human nature deeply wounded by this infamous practice.
Okay, let's not start at the beginning here. Let's start at the second sentence, because that's really where we get to the meat of this argument. The abolition of domestic slavery is the great object of desire in those colonies where it was unhappily introduced in their infant state. That's Thomas Jefferson writing that. That doesn't sound like Thomas Jefferson or the Thomas Jefferson that we know. So some people so what is he making? He's making the argument here that Virginia wishes to abolish domestic slavery, not the slave trade, not a gradual very slow abolition or waiting for it to die out, which is more or less what the Constitutional Convention kind of crossed its fingers and held its breath, and maybe most of them hoped would happen, which never did. But the abolition of domestic slavery. Why is he saying this? Well, I think most historians who treat Jefferson would agree that Jefferson has very conflicted ideas about domestic slavery. And does he mean this? It's quite likely he meant it. At different times in his life, he condemns slavery quite eloquently. He does in the Declaration, by the way, and he takes a similar position in the Declaration in a long clause to the Declaration that was deleted by Franklin and Adams. They said, you can never put this in the Declaration. You have to take it out. And the reason that they wanted him to take it out, this long justification for slavery being instituted by the English authorities and significantly by the current English king of all things, right? They said this, they probably didn't say it directly to him, but it read as much too hypocritical. So what does he mean? What he's actually talking about a real thing. He's not just saying, oh yes, we're giving our hopes, our thoughts and prayers to the idea that someday all folks will be free in America. Wouldn't that be lovely? It's not that. What he's arguing is, but previous to the enfranchisement here means the liberation, the emancipation. Doesn't mean voting rights. Not going that far. But previous to the emancipation, enfranchisement of the slaves we have, it is necessary to exclude all further importations from Africa. Okay, so what he's saying is we need a restriction on the slave trade. Okay, now remember that actually this happens. This is the one restriction on slavery that actually does happen, originating in the Constitution, right? And then they give the South, as a compromise, a 20-year waiting period. And they say, well, within 20 years, Congress may regulate certain trade. They don't say what it is because, they never use the word slavery in the Constitution, right? All right. Now, here, Jefferson is happy to mention it. So excluding importations from Africa. So how would that work? In other words, one idea, okay, on its surface, and this would be embraced by certain groups that were really strongly and unhypocritically anti-slavery, like the Quakers, would be first to get rid of the slave trade. Everybody knew it was an abomination. And nobody in the 18th century was apologizing for the African slave trade. They knew it was horrible. It was a horror. It was a profoundly antithetical to everything that they believed, right? Or they professed as religious people or as people of the Enlightenment. They couldn't justify it. So ending the African slave trade on the one hand would be a very good human rights benefit. But on the other hand, and this is exactly what happened when they ended the African slave trade, who then would supply the slaves? If all they did was to exclude all further importations from Africa, the slaves who were on the market, so to speak, would be the slaves that were already in America. And who would be the most likely colony to export surplus slaves? The colony that was wearing out its tobacco lands, that had less and less yields from tobacco, was trying to change its whole cultivation practices more into cereal grains and less into the cultivation of tobacco, opening up the slave labor to the lower South, which was involved in more profitable staple production. Not cotton yet, but think about that. So the colony that would profit from the end of the African slave trade, the colony that would most profit, would be Virginia. So his claim is already a little hypocritical because we know that when they actually exclude importation from Africa, it is a good thing. It actually does benefit slaves to some limited extent. It certainly ends the horror, and they enforce it mostly. So it ends the horror, for the most part, of the importation of Africans from their homeland over the seas with huge numbers of death and suffering that we all know about. Okay? But on the other hand, Virginia immediately embarks on selling excess slaves to the Deep South and tries to recoup the profits that they're failing to get on their lands. Right? So just the exclusion of slaves from Africa isn't that big a step. Okay, now they don't get to the point in any of these colonies, not even in New England, of ending slavery. They don't. There are colonies like Virginia does this, and Pennsylvania does it, Rhode Island at one point, they all legislate, right, to end the slave trade. And here he's telling the truth, yet our repeated attempts to effect this by prohibition, in other words, to enact a prohibition of the slave trade, and by imposing duties so that it might amount to a prohibition. In other words, you'd have such a high tariff on slave labor coming from Africa that you wouldn't be profitable, have hitherto been defeated by His Majesty's negative. Yale professor Stephen Pincus has written about this, and he's looked into it very carefully. The king did veto a lot of these measures. It was kind of routinely vetoed by the king, thus preferring the immediate advantages of few African corsairs to the lasting interests of the American states. And what is really happening there is Jefferson has a point, which is that since the 17th century, since the Stuart monarchs, the English crown has favored African slave trade, has favored the creation of a different kind of slavery in the law, because remember, slavery in European common law, in English common law rather, doesn't exist, right? And so in these years, right up to 1770 anyway, when they're talking about whom does the king favor, it is true that they favored the slave traders, who were more likely to be well-connected Englishmen, right, with very powerful friends in Parliament and in the Privy Council, over the Americans. That's true. But it's also true that their intention, that I've just described, was not to abolish domestic slavery. It may have been their great object of desire in the colonies, but it wasn't anywhere near being enacted, even in the New England colonies, where slavery was really inconsequential, let alone in Virginia, where 40% of the population was enslaved. So this is where Jefferson gets a reputation for hypocrisy. Okay. And the rights of human nature deeply wounded by this infamous practice. There is no one more eloquent about the tyranny of slavery and how it affects the slave and the slaveholder, and what slavery does to the society. There's no one who argues this better. Jefferson, in his own quiet way, is not quite as powerful as Frederick Douglass, but he makes a very powerful indictment of slavery because he lives it and he knows it. He knows how evil it is, but he never, ever gets around to the idea of actually enacting anything close to the abolition of domestic slavery. The only thing Jefferson does do, and we have to give him credit, is to sponsor. He's really the person who writes up and sponsors the Northwest Ordinance, which allows the Northwest Territories to be free of slavery, thus setting up the North-South sectional tension that will afflict the Union, not right away, but in later years before the Civil War. But so he can see the advantages of a place that doesn't have slavery. He can see that it's a violation of human rights. He gets very much into this, that the king, he says, has violated the right of liberty among Africans. Well, the king didn't do that. slave traders from Virginia did that. They were trading, the demand was in Virginia, and they were buying the slaves. And the king was not that directly involved in this. And it was, this is why that portion of the Declaration of Independence never made it into the actual document. Okay.
I have one more quote. We're going to stop and let Allison take a question.
So this next question that we have comes from Sean, and Sean wants to know if this document goes on to influence George Mason and Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights in 1776.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Jefferson and Mason had shared many ideas. Mason, of course, went further in condemning slavery. Mason had a smaller number of human beings that he held in property, but he didn't emancipate them, which is kind of a surprising thing about George Mason. Mason was more eloquent and less hypocritical in his condemnation of slavery. But yes, absolutely. This is something that Virginians, it's very interesting, and I think it's worth remembering. When you think about 18th century Americans, even in South Carolina and Georgia, where slavery is absolutely a fact of life. South Carolina, where 90% of the people in the lowland parishes of South Carolina around Charleston are enslaved, okay? But they know it's wrong. There's no one apologizing for slavery at this moment in American history. There's nobody saying, oh, this is a good thing. And when a few begin to say something about it being a good thing, I was noticing in that, again, going back to that PBS document about Franklin, some people were beginning to say, well, we've Christianized them, we've civilized them. So Franklin issues this wonderful satire, and he says, pretends to be a Muslim from North Africa. There was, of course, a practice among the North African states of enslaving people by the same rule that the Europeans used, which was, oh, we can enslave Africans because they're not part of our religion. North Africans had the same rule. That's how it started. Of course, ultimately it became about race. But North Africans had the same rule. Oh, well, Christians can be enslaved, sure. And so Franklin, pretending to be an African Muslim, says, well, look at what good we're doing them. They're seeing the true faith. They're becoming civilized. We treat them very well. And it's all getting to the preposterousness of an argument that slavery is a beneficial for the slave.
So the next question comes from Linda, and Linda wants to know, on a scale from timid to bold, where does this document fall in relationship to the Declaration of the Causes and Necessities of Taking Up Arms and Declaration of Independence?
And I'm sorry, what was the second one?
Declaration of Independence.
It's earlier, but it's very provocative. We see here Jefferson is making an eloquent argument for the counselors, for the representatives. So it's different from the Declaration of Taking Up Arms. It's, that's a more radical document still. But this is an argument for Americans' autonomy. If you read the document entirely, he professes loyalty to the crown. And, he's professing that he is, of course, a British subject. And all of the people who are attending the Virginia Convention, including Patrick Henry, would have said the same, right? So they're not arguing for taking up arms yet, but we're on the way. We are independent. We have no obligation to adhere to any of these interferences by the British Parliament. They have no rights over us. And the British King, who is really just kind of a constitutional executive, he has a few limited powers. Mostly, though, he is the head of state. And that's why we profess our loyalty to him. It's definitely taking a very big step constitutionally and legally towards that independence movement.
Andy, we have 4 minutes left. So do you want to skip the next quote and then just go on to what came next?
Sure.
Okay. So what did come next?
Oh, we're going to skip it.
Or do you want to
Yep.
go through this one really quickly?
Let's see real quick if I can. This is about the laws of the British sending troops to America. And I'll just say this. It says to render these proceedings, that is sending troops to keep order in America, troops that were paid by the king, a standing army, in other words, which of course, if you look at the Third Amendment, that is Third and the Second Amendment, both to the Constitution, they both protect us against that standing army. To render these proceedings still more criminal against our laws, instead of subjecting the military to the civil powers, His Majesty has expressly made the civil subordinate to the military. This is a violation of all English constitutional government. Cromwell is probably the only one who attempted this in the recent memory of the English history, right? Where the military took over the civil authority under Cromwell. Okay, so what comes next? The Declaration of Independence. And as we'll see, I mean, Jefferson is very eloquent here. He's writing for a larger audience. He makes the very first sentence, the very first phrase is an attempt to create a kind of bond, not just with his fellow representatives, his fellow Virginia gentry, or even American political advocates. It is with all people, when in the course of human events, human, not men's events, men's memories, not men and women, not Americans, human. Think about that. That's the broadest attempt to create a common bond Jefferson could have made in the language of the 18th century. He's trying to create, and when he speaks unequivocally about equality in a way that he may not see as bounded, although he agrees in the part I said in the Declaration that Africans have the same inalienable right to liberty as everyone else. He says owning about 250 human beings. But by saying it unequivocally, he gives the signal to people like Abigail Adams, who hears those words and says to John Adams, remember the ladies. Remember the ladies, because she's hearing it. She's hearing that's argument for equality, and she's not hearing that it's bounded by gender. And other people are hearing it and hear that it's not bounded by race. Enslaved people on the docks in Charleston, when it's read out, are mumbling under their breath, liberty, oh liberty, liberty, oh liberty. They hear the call for liberty. Jefferson has launched something that is far beyond his own bounded vision. He had a broad vision that extended beyond his own half-hearted attempts to implement it. He had a vision that was seized upon by all those different people outside of the normal political boundaries, and they didn't give it up. And it starts there. We are independent. He may have been on dubious historical grounds, but he's saying something that is inarguable. Americans were born free. Americans, at least who are not enslaved, have the right to independence, to autonomy. And soon, in another 80 years, there will be a great war to say that all Americans, white and black, slave and free, have a right to their own autonomy. That starts with this summary view.
Thank you. And I just pulled up the signatures here so you can see Thomas Jefferson's actual signature.
Yeah.
So this is printed in 1820 by William Stone. It's an exact replica of the one that's signed, and he created it by wetting a piece of paper, putting it on top of the Declaration, pulling up some of the ink, and then carving that on a plate to create his. But you can see Thomas Jefferson here, and he has the TH instead of just the regular T. It's a little, there's some differences here.
It's yeah, he does it the same way with the TH. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. Very good. So Allison, is there one or two more questions you want to ask?
Oh, I was muted. I've been doing that too much this year. I mean, we talked about a 2-year anniversary. I should have this down pat by now.
Absolutely.
There's a question from William, and William wants to know what the king's reaction was to this document.
We don't actually have a historical record of how the king, reacted. We, of course, it's the same thing with the actual declaration, which is far more dramatic. But we can expect that, this was reported to him by the members of government. Lord North would have certainly mentioned it to His Majesty. Remember that this comes after this argument, this summary view comes after the Boston Tea Party. And we didn't really get into it in depth here, but there's a strong justification that Jefferson makes for the Boston Tea Party as well, for the righteousness of the Boston Tea Party. And there was no one in the English government among the English who were adherent to the party of the king who would have accepted that argument. So I'm sure that it infuriated the British government authorities who read it. They would be infuriated and they would be prepared for more draconian measures to apply. They would, in other words, double down on what they had already done, because this would seem an outrageous and provocative argument to them. There were, by the way, though, many Whigs that was a name for the British, who were more inclined to view human rights, who were opposed to His Majesty, who voted against His Majesty's government. And it's the Whigs who, all through the American Revolution, carry on, usually in kind of quiet support of the Americans. But at this early stage, there's still some of them are still outspoken about the Americans saying something that's right. And they would have continued to support the Americans. Remember, this is something, again, going back to John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, both of whom represent the colonies later, and right before Franklin is right there in the midst of all of this in 1774 and early 1775. And he's trying to say to these Whigs, look, we can still put this together. We can still make this work. But the king and the prime minister, they would not have been happy with this document.
Not at all. One more, Allison.
Yeah, let's do one more. So the final question comes from James, and James wants to know, in this pamphlet, to what extent was Jefferson synthesizing existing ideas on liberty and rights versus generating his own original contributions to that conversation?
It's the Declaration of Independence is a similar thing. This is not the same kind of Lockean document. When Jefferson gets to the Declaration, he's writing straight out of Locke, right? And as we all know, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness comes from Locke's triad: life, liberty, and property. The Declaration, I mean, it's not that there aren't other ideas in there. There are other political theories that contribute to Jefferson's thought, but there's a lot of Locke in the Declaration of Independence. Very few historians disagree with that. This is a more unique document. It comes out of what Jefferson believes. And some of this stuff, is kind of the common opinion of that group of sort of more radical Virginia gentry, men like Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee. They would have discussed this with Jefferson. He would have discussed it. He's not, Madison is not even out of college yet. So in Madison and he haven't formed that close friendship, but he's reading this, discussing it, talking about it. This is a kind of common, when you're writing this kind of summary view, you want to be sure that you're writing for everyone else. You don't want to be writing something that only you believe and no one else agrees with. That's not the way to write history, and it's not the way to write a provocative legal argument. This is a commonly accepted. As I say, the whole idea, well, we didn't accept any aid from the king or from the crown until after the French and Indian War. That's a common idea. As I said, it's historically wrong, but it comes out of a kind of common knowledge and common understanding. And the whole notion of alloidial versus feudal law, that's again something that had been argued by other people at the same time. But Jefferson is arguing in the same vein as Thomas Paine is. Paine doesn't make this exact argument, but he is arguing also just shortly after this right? When he's writing Common Sense, he's saying we owe no allegiance to the king. Paine goes further. We do not owe any allegiance to the king, and here's why. But he's making the same argument that Americans have never had to depend on the mother country or on royal authority or on parliamentary authority, where they came to America on their own and they have natural rights that adhere to them in that state of nature, at which they arrived when they stepped off the boat. So it's common, but it's also, like so much of Jefferson, it's systematic, it's eloquent, it's well thought through, and it makes a good argument. As I said, I don't agree with all of it, not the part about slavery or the autonomy of Englishmen arriving in America and arriving in a vacant land. Those are very dubious propositions, but it makes a good argument about natural liberty that we can still agree to this day.
Thank you. And with that, we are going to ask Allison to tell us about some upcoming programs.
I am. So our next session of Inside the Vault is going to be May 5th, again at 7 p.m. And I am very excited for this next program. We are discussing the life and times of President Theodore Roosevelt, but not just that. We'll be joined by someone who we think, has a pretty good grasp on the former president. We'll be joined by Teddy Roosevelt's great-grandson, Tweed Roosevelt. So absolutely, you will not want to miss that conversation. Shelby is putting the link to that page in the chat right now. Summer seminars are live. Register now for a plethora of amazing options, both in person and virtual, including our first ever teacher symposium at Gettysburg College. One of the sessions being offered this summer is taught by our very own Dr. Robertson, Foundations of American Government, 1761 to 801. So again, lots of things that you will not want to miss this summer.
Yeah, and I'm an alumna of Gettysburg College. I can tell you the merger of like our summer teacher program with Gettysburg, it's like perfect because we have high quality program that's Gettysburg. The campus is gorgeous. You couldn't ask for a better location. So totally recommend that one.
Absolutely. And if you are in the Chicago area on the 21st of April, we are offering a free, big letters, free in-person workshop as part of the America's Unseen Soldiers series. So it'll feature a 3-hour lecture and a Q&A with Professor Stephen Rosales on fighting the peace at home, Mexican-American veterans, and the 1944 GI Bill of Rights, and Macho Nation, Chicano soldiering, sexuality, and manhood during the Vietnam War era. It'll be followed by a pedagogy workshop, as well as a guided tour of Abraham Lincoln National Cemetery. And speaking of Abraham Lincoln, the Abraham Lincoln Book Prize is taking place next Thursday evening. You can sign up to watch the virtual portion of that, which begins at 7:50 p.m. Professor Caroline Janey is being awarded the prize for her book, Ends of War, The Unfinished Fight of Lee's Army After Appomattox. So you won't want to miss any of these opportunities that you have to continue to learn more about history.
Thank you, Allison. And thank you, Dr. Robertson. We are so excited to be with you tonight. It was great. I highly recommend everybody download the pamphlet. It's on our website, Allison. We're also including it in the follow-up email you're getting tomorrow. So you will get an email with the recorded video, with the slide deck, and with the actual full pamphlet, right, Allison? We do include all three.
That's
So
right.
absolutely take time to read it. It's an amazing piece. So Andy, do you have any final words?
I just want to say what a pleasure this has been. I think it really opens up a document that was unknown to us, and it really gives us a sense of the mind of a great founder, and also the conflicted and complicated understanding that he has of the American claim for liberty. So I'm so glad that we had this chance to explore it together.